She sat alone in first class, surrounded by whispers that weren't meant for her ears and glances sharp enough to cut through steel. Every smile she received was a mask hiding indifference, or worse, a calculated dismissal. This wasn't just about a seat. It was a silent war fought in the shadows of luxury and privilege, where the rules bent around color and power. But beneath the quiet suffering lay a secret, one so explosive it would shake an entire airline to its core and expose the blind spots of a system that thought it was untouchable. The moment when that secret surfaced turned everything upside down, and nothing would ever be the same. If you want to uncover the truth behind the silence, hit like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. What do you think will happen when power meets justice in the sky? Zariah Ellison had boarded hundreds of flights in her life, but this time was different. She knew it from the moment her heels hit the threshold of the aircraft. The polished floor of the jet bridge gave way to a sudden stillness, like the entire cabin collectively held its breath as she entered. The hum of polite conversation dulled. A few heads turned, then immediately turned back again, feigning disinterest. She was dressed in a sharp, slate gray suit and carried herself with calm, composed dignity. She didn't look out of place, she never had. Yet here, among passengers clutching designer bags and wearing the ease of inherited privilege like a second skin, she felt the subtle weight of being seen but not welcomed. When she reached her seat, a window seat she had booked weeks in advance, she looked up to store her carry-on. No one moved. No flight attendant offered to help. Her arms reached up, and just as she was lifting the bag, an attendant stepped into her peripheral vision and said nothing. She watched silently, didn't offer assistance, didn't ask if she needed anything, just stood there with hands clasped behind her back, eyes flat, mouth tight. Zariah slid the bag in and adjusted her blazer, offering a brief smile that was neither returned nor acknowledged. She sat down. The seat was pristine. The cabin smelled of citrus and leather, but the air around her was already too cold. She glanced around. A man in a navy blazer 2 rows ahead was being served champagne with 2 lemon twists. A couple across the aisle received hot towels and quiet laughter from a cheerful flight attendant. Zariah waited. No one came. She folded her hands in her lap. Blythe, the name on the chief attendant's badge, stood near the front galley, whispering something to a younger crew member. Zariah's service light was on. No one acknowledged it. She waited, the amber glow casting a soft hue above her seat. When the young crew member walked by, she kept her eyes forward, ignoring Zariah entirely. A white woman with oversized sunglasses passed her row, struggling with her Chanel tote. The woman's bag brushed Zariah's knee, nearly knocking her tablet to the floor. Zariah offered a polite nod and shifted slightly. The woman didn't say a word. Instead, she glanced down at Zariah's dark skin, then turned her head and laughed at something her companion behind her had said. Zariah turned her attention to the window. The tarmac glowed beneath late afternoon sunlight, golden and clean. It didn't feel like luxury. It felt like trial. Blythe eventually approached, not to serve Zariah, but to hand a menu to the passenger in seat 2B, a white man in a striped tie who had already finished his drink. Zariah watched as the woman leaned forward, whispering something and smirking. The man glanced sideways at Zariah, then chuckled. Blythe didn't look in her direction. The silence was becoming more than exclusion. It was performance. It was reinforcement. Blythe remained stationed near the galley, now speaking with a middle-aged male passenger in the forward row who appeared utterly at ease, leaning back in his seat with his drink in hand and a grin that spread easily across his face. He looked like he belonged. He looked like someone they wanted to serve. Zariah, meanwhile, had not been approached again, not to ask if she wanted anything, not to offer a beverage, not to check her comfort. The air in the cabin was temperature-controlled, but somehow felt colder around her, as if she were in a pocket of space excluded from standard service. The overhead lights dimmed slightly in preparation for takeoff. A junior flight attendant walked down the aisle with a tray of warm towels, her eyes bright and her tone cheerful. She placed towels gently onto the hands of each first-class passenger in her row, their thanks echoing softly in succession. But when she reached Zariah, Her pace didn't even falter. She skipped the row entirely, as if the seat were empty, as if Zoraya had become transparent. Zoraya didn't flinch. She simply watched the attendant continue without pause, then hand a towel to the man across the aisle who was mid-conversation with another passenger about his recent golf trip to Scottsdale. Zoraya didn't react outwardly. She knew what was happening. It was intentional, slow, and quiet, crafted to avoid open confrontation while still sending a message. She had seen it before in corporate boardrooms, in high-end restaurants, at luxury hotel check-ins. The tone of exclusion was never shouted. It was whispered, and always unmistakable. As the plane lifted off the runway, Zoraya leaned her head slightly against the headrest and closed her eyes, trying to steady the pressure building behind them. She could feel the vibration of the engines beneath her seat, a low, rising hum that echoed like tension held just beneath the surface. Once the aircraft reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt signs dimmed, the service resumed with new energy. Drinks began to flow. The smell of hot food curled through the cabin. Blythe emerged again with a practiced smile that changed shape depending on whom she approached. She stopped at nearly every seat in the cabin. She offered dinner options with warmth and pleasant tone. At seat 2A, however, she simply paused for a half-second in front of Zoraya, turned her head slightly as if reconsidering the effort, and moved on without speaking. Zoraya waited. She did not call out. She did not reach for her service button again. She had already tried that, and it had been ignored. But just as her silence became an armor, a new cut came. The junior attendant returned, now distributing menus to passengers who had not yet received them. She reached seat 2B, Zoraya's row, and placed a menu down for the man seated beside her, a clean-shaven businessman in a tailored blue suit. Then, with the same practiced ease, she skipped Zoraya entirely. No second menu, no offer, no eye contact. As the attendant moved away, Zoraya gently leaned to the side and glanced toward the man's menu. It was a standard 3-course selection offered on all premium flights, nothing new. But the absence of one on her tray table was not about content. It was about message. It was about control. She leaned back in her seat, her chest rising slower now, her body adjusting to the invisible shape of dismissal being placed around her. The clouds beyond the glass shifted in soft waves, indifferent and unreachable, a distant contrast to the human coldness pressing in from every side. Zoraya knew this wasn't random. It had moved past oversight and into orchestration. Every skip towel, missed drink, ignored request was a tile in a pattern she'd seen countless times in different forms. At work, in restaurants, in quiet halls of power. Here, however, stripped of a title or context, seated only as herself, she was vulnerable in ways her credentials never allowed in boardrooms. Here, they saw only what they wanted to see, a woman who didn't belong in their eyes. The curtain separating first class from the rest of the aircraft rustled as a junior attendant stepped through, carrying a clipboard. She walked directly to seat 2A and paused, clearly instructed by someone else to approach. Zoraya turned, her face calm, but her chest tightening. The attendant glanced down at her notes, cleared her throat slightly, and then held out the clipboard with both hands. Without explanation, she gestured to a highlighted line and pointed at the signature box. Zoraya hesitated. The clipboard bore the airline's crest and a printed form titled Premium Cabin Seating Confirmation. Her eyes narrowed. She had never seen such a form before, not in all her years of travel. Passengers across the aisle looked over, subtly, like spectators pretending disinterest. Zoraya knew this wasn't protocol, it was performance. Her presence was being questioned in an official-looking format, a bureaucratic veil for humiliation. She signed the form without a word and handed it back. The attendant nodded slightly and turned without further instruction, walking back to the galley with her clipboard like someone who had simply completed a mundane task. Moments later, another form of degradation unfolded. Blythe approached the man in 2B, speaking in a low but friendly tone. She leaned slightly toward him, smiling as she confirmed his special meal preferences and asked if he would like to participate in the pilot's feedback survey for VIP guests. He nodded and responded with visible pleasure at the attention. Then, with her body angled just enough to exclude Zariah, Blythe turned slightly and said something inaudible to the man that caused him to glance sideways towards Zariah with a flicker of curiosity. Whatever was said was meant for him alone, but the context wasn't difficult to decode. Zariah could feel the heat rise behind her ears. Her chest remained steady, but the pain of being talked around, of being discussed like a misplaced item, settled deep in her sternum. She turned her head back toward the window, but the reflection in the glass showed everything. Blythe's posture, the man's half-smile, the junior attendants watching from the galley with veiled amusement. Time passed slowly. The cabin settled into a quiet lull. A low hum of conversation mixed with the soft clinking of cutlery. Zariah had long since given up expecting service. Her tray was still in place. No one came for it. When a new round of drinks was offered to passengers, she was skipped once again. This time, she didn't even look up. She had trained herself in moments like these to remain still, to reduce her emotional visibility, to deny them the satisfaction of reaction. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. In fact, the hurt deepened in silence. Each quiet refusal of her presence etched itself deeper, and the sense of helplessness grew heavier. She was a woman who made decisions that shaped markets, who sat at tables where global partnerships were negotiated. And yet here, in this floating chamber of casual cruelty, she had no voice, no power, no shield. Suddenly, a small commotion broke the tension. A flight attendant rushed past, holding a garment bag above her head, moving toward a white woman 2 rows ahead who clapped softly in delight upon receiving it. It was a luxury jacket that had apparently been misplaced during boarding. The woman held it up, examining it with glee as the attendant apologized profusely for the mix-up. They laughed together like old friends. And just like that, attention shifted. Everyone nearby joined in the mirth, a shared moment of comfort and belonging. Zariah remained outside of it, not only unseen, but excluded by design. She did not exist in the ecosystem of their joy. In contrast, Zariah's screen was still off, untouched, her blanket left folded on the floor near her feet, where it had been dropped earlier by a rushing crew member and never retrieved. It had happened while the junior attendant leaned over her to adjust the reading light for the man in 2B, knocking the blanket from her seat back without acknowledgement or apology. When Zariah reached to pick it up, her hand was gently but firmly brushed away by Blythe, who appeared suddenly and informed her that it would be replaced for sanitary reasons. No replacement ever came. The most mundane requests, the ones that passengers around her made without thought, an extra pillow, a warm cookie, a simple cup of tea, were being denied to her through silence, delay, or vague procedural excuses. It was a system built on plausible deniability, where no one could quite accuse the crew of open hostility, and yet no honest observer could miss what was happening. Zariah understood it perfectly. The abuse didn't need to be loud to be effective. It just needed to be constant and consistent, hidden beneath the surface of airline protocol and professional smiles. Blythe returned once more, this time holding a small device in her hand, a service monitor used to control seat settings and monitor passenger comfort systems. She stopped at Zariah's row and asked, with thinly veiled irritation, whether Zariah had been tampering with the seat controls. Zariah, who hadn't even reclined the seat since boarding, looked up slowly. Blythe didn't wait for a response before pressing several buttons on the monitor and muttering something about restoring default functions. She then walked away without making eye contact. Moments later, Zariah pressed the recline button to shift her seat slightly for rest. Nothing happened. The motor was disabled. She tried again. Still nothing. A faint click, followed by silence. It was now locked in its upright position. Across the aisle, passengers shifted comfortably into near horizontal positions, lights dimmed, and warm drinks cradled. Zariah sat upright, rigid, her back aching against the unforgiving posture. No one returned to check on her. No explanation was ever offered. She debated calling for assistance again, but past experience told her it would only worsen things. The call light itself had become an unspoken offense, a silent challenge that was always answered with either delay or disdain. Instead, she pulled a silk scarf from her bag and folded it behind her neck, trying to cushion the seat back. The gesture was small, but it felt like rebellion. Her own comfort, however slight, reclaimed without permission. Moments later, the man in 2B stretched and sighed in satisfaction, his seat fully extended. He turned toward Zoraya for a moment, his expression unreadable, then returned to his screen and pressed his headset deeper into his ears. An hour passed, the plane now quiet except for the occasional rattle of turbulence. Zoraya's legs began to cramp. She stood slowly to stretch them in the aisle. No sooner had she risen than Blythe reappeared as if summoned. She approached with a polite but firm tone, informing Zoraya that due to new in-flight movement restrictions, passengers were advised to remain seated unless using the lavatory. Zoraya nodded silently and returned to her seat. No such instruction was given to any other passenger during the next hour. Others wandered freely to bathrooms, stretched in aisles, and chatted with attendants near the galley. Later, when dessert service began, a luxury reserved for premium cabin guests, Zoraya watched as others received plated selections of cheesecake, fruit, and espresso. The cart stopped at a row, but not for her. The attendant served the man in 2B, who chose a slice of cake and received it with a nod. Then the cart rolled forward. Zoraya was neither offered nor acknowledged. She shifted slightly in her seat, but no one turned back. The man beside her, licking his fork, didn't glance in her direction. Around her, the other passengers were cocooned in a kind of warmth and privilege that operated like a closed circuit, one she had been intentionally disconnected from. Most were reclined beneath blankets, sipping wine, or drifting in and out of sleep as the cabin lighting shifted into a deeper indigo hue. Zoraya had stopped trying to call for assistance. Every button push had been ignored, every direct request deflected or unmet. But just when she thought the indignities might finally give way to indifference, a new strategy emerged, more physical, more intrusive, and disturbingly intentional. It began with the food cart. Twice now, it had passed by with its metal edges scraping against her knee as it moved through the narrow aisle. The first time had caught her by surprise. She had tucked her legs properly, feet aligned with the base of her seat, but the impact came regardless, a quick, hard knock against her right knee. She flinched slightly, biting the inside of her cheek to keep from reacting. The junior attendant, pushing the cart, gave no sign of acknowledgement, no apology, no glance. She simply kept moving. Zoraya adjusted her leg inward more tightly. On the second pass, the cart hit her again, this time on the shin. Not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to send a message. This time, Zoraya's eyes followed the cart all the way up the aisle. Blythe stood near the front, speaking to the same group of passengers she'd fawned over earlier. When she turned, her eyes met Zoraya's for a brief instant. No expression, just a blink. Then she turned back to her conversation. The contact had not been random. It had been coordinated, part of a quiet effort to not only neglect Zoraya, but to subtly remind her that she was in someone else's space. A space she was not welcome to inhabit in comfort. The third time the cart approached, Zoraya adjusted her leg even further into her own seat, hugging her knees slightly toward herself. It passed without touching her this time, but only narrowly. The avoidance felt like a game, a performance where her reactions were being measured. When she made no move to protest, the pattern changed. Later, as the attendants moved about the cabin offering mid-flight amenities, Zoraya noticed something strange. A hot towel was placed on the tray table of the man beside her. Another was delivered to the woman across the aisle. Each attendant moved with fluid precision, speaking softly, smiling as they worked. Zoraya's tray remained bare. No towel, no acknowledgement. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to scan the aisle for validation, but the omission spoke louder than any insult. She had become a blind spot in the cabin, a presence deliberately excluded from the choreography of service. Then came the wine service. A bottle of Cabernet was being poured freely among the front rows. A tray of crystal glasses clinked gently as they were distributed, each with a white napkin and a polite smile. The attendant serving the man in 2B turned to place his glass delicately beside his hand. He raised it with a nod of thanks, not even glancing in Zoraya's direction. When the attendant turned toward her seat, Zoraya expected, perhaps foolishly, that she might be offered one too. But instead, the attendant stepped past her row entirely, moving on to the next guest. No hesitation, no acknowledgement. Zoraya blinked once, then turned her head slightly to look at the window. It reflected only darkness now, the night sky void of stars, as if even the universe had decided not to meet her gaze. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, steady, but clearly audible. "Excuse me," she said, just loud enough for the returning attendant to hear as she passed. The attendant paused and looked at her with practiced neutrality. "Could I have some water?" Zoraya asked. The attendant nodded once, without speaking, then turned and walked away. 10 minutes passed, then 20. No water came. At 30 minutes, the cart returned with glasses of juice and soda for other passengers. No water. No mention of her request. Zoraya said nothing further. Her mouth was dry, her lips cracked slightly. The refusal to serve was no longer neglect, it was punishment. As she shifted in her seat to relieve her hip, now sore from the rigid chair, her elbow accidentally nudged the remote embedded in the armrest. The in-flight screen flickered on. She had not used it once during the entire trip. It displayed the flight map, the plane drifting slowly across the Atlantic. She pressed a button to adjust the screen's brightness, but it did not respond. She tried again. Nothing. She toggled the controls, and again, the monitor remained static. Whether by malfunction or design, her screen, like her seat, had been quietly disabled. Another passenger nearby leaned into their own screen, laughing softly at a comedy special. Zoraya turned hers off and folded her hands in her lap. Sleep was impossible. Her body ached with fatigue, but she could not find rest. The plane's gentle hum felt like background noise to the internal scream building in her chest. A scream she dared not release. She had endured too many hours of deliberate, coordinated slights to lose control now. Instead, she sat silently, holding every ounce of humiliation inside her like a secret no one else was allowed to see. Around her, the attendants moved like shadows, breezing past her, leaning over her seat to hand chocolates and mints to others, adjusting pillows for guests who needed nothing. The man in 2B adjusted his noise-canceling headset, leaned back, and sighed contentedly. Zoraya stared straight ahead. The flight attendants passed her without pause, attending to others with warmth and efficiency. What began as indifference had morphed into an orchestrated performance of exclusion, one the entire cabin now seemed complicit in maintaining. The discomfort they inflicted on her had been normalized, wrapped in plausible professionalism and silence. But this next stage was different. It was no longer just about her suffering in isolation. It was about involving the crowd, weaponizing the very passengers around her to deepen her degradation. It began when a crew member discreetly leaned over to speak to the passenger in 3B, a white woman in her 50s wearing a designer silk scarf and heavy pearls. The woman's eyes briefly flicked towards Zoraya, and her mouth twisted into something between curiosity and contempt. The attendant said nothing to Zoraya, but moments later, the woman was escorted up the aisle and reseated beside Zoraya in 2B, replacing the quiet man who had shared the row without incident for most of the flight. No explanation was given. The man stood, gathered his things without question, and disappeared down the aisle, reassigned as if his seat had never belonged to him. The woman took his place with deliberate ceremony, placing her handbag between their seats as a barrier, pulling a silk shawl tight around her shoulders, and crossing her legs away from Zoraya with exaggerated care. The message was clear. Zoraya was not to be engaged with. She was to be contained. Zoraya sat still, refusing to give in to the wave of humiliation washing over her again. She turned slightly toward the window, trying to escape into the dark sky outside, but her reflection stared back at her, tired and tense, jaw tight, eyes glossy. She blinked it away and exhaled through her nose. Minutes passed before a small chime indicated turbulence ahead. Seatbelt lights blinked on overhead, and a soft announcement played instructing passengers to remain seated. The plane shuddered gently as it passed through the first rough pocket of air. As the turbulence grew, the flight attendants moved quickly to secure loose items, retract service carts, and ensure passengers were safely buckled in. They returned to their seats and began distributing hot towels as part of the night routine, a final comfort gesture before the cabin settled into full darkness. One by one, passengers received warm, folded towels placed gently into their open palms. Some pressed them to their faces, others wrapped them around their necks. The scent of lavender drifted softly through the air. The attendant reached row 2, where Zoraya sat frozen in anticipation, hoping, if only for a moment, that perhaps this time the routine would include her, that maybe someone would break the pattern. The woman next to her received a towel, her hand outstretched impatiently. The attendant placed it gently onto her palm, then turned and walked away. Zoraya's hands remained open, empty. The warmth stopped short of her skin. Her throat burned, but she made no sound. She sat back slowly, forcing the tension from her fingers, refusing to clench them, refusing to shake. The towel cart moved on, wrapping others in comfort, in dignity, in humanity. It passed her like a tide parting around a stone. She was left cold. Again, a nearby couple whispered softly, glancing toward her. The woman leaned into her partner's shoulder, her voice low but pointed. Zoraya heard the distinct cadence of disapproval, not loud enough to catch the words, but unmistakable in tone. It was the language of judgment, of suspicion wrapped in civility. A shared look, a raised brow, an unspoken question. What is she doing here? Why is she still in that seat? Across the aisle, a young man snorted quietly and turned up the volume on his movie, as if to block out the tension radiating from her row. No one said anything directly to Zoraya, but the air was thick with implication. She could feel the shifting currents of collective judgment. Their silence, once passive, had turned participatory. Every passenger who turned their head and said nothing was another thread tightening the rope around her. She was no longer just being mistreated by the crew. Now the cabin itself had become complicit. The woman beside her coughed deliberately, then reached up to adjust the air vent above their seats. She angled it to blast air directly towards Zoraya, then leaned back with a self-satisfied huff, arms crossed. The cold air hit Zoraya's face like a slap. She reached up to redirect it, but the knob stuck. She tried again, quietly, carefully. Still stuck. She stopped, her hand retreating to her lap, unwilling to draw more attention. The vent continued to blow. She sat beneath it in silence, the chill soaking through her blazer like another unspoken insult. Time dragged. Sleep was still impossible. Her body longed to escape its rigid position, her eyes burned from fatigue, but she would not allow herself to close them. She had begun to realize that nothing was accidental. Every omission, every exclusion, every shift in seating and service had been orchestrated to push her into a place beyond discomfort. They wanted her to feel exposed, outnumbered, unwanted. It wasn't about pushing her out of the cabin. It was about making her want to leave it herself. Later, as passengers began stirring for the final service before descent, the crew re-emerged with smiles and soft voices, offering breakfast selections. The woman beside her asked for oatmeal with fruit and received it promptly, complete with a steaming mug of coffee and a linen napkin. Zoraya waited, eyes down. When the cart arrived, the junior attendant looked over the list, then picked up a small plastic container, handed it to Zoraya without speaking, and moved on. Inside was a dry muffin, sealed in cellophane, without utensils or napkin. Zoraya accepted it with both hands, careful not to show the tremor in her grip. The woman beside her looked over with a smirk, took a long sip of her coffee, then turned away. Zoraya didn't eat. The descent began shortly afterward, the cabin lights warming, the seatbelt signs returning. Flight attendants moved swiftly, preparing for landing, checking latches, straightening seatbacks. One last chance for decency, Zoraya thought, but none came. Her seat remained stuck, her tray unrepaired, her presence unacknowledged. The woman beside her stood quickly once the plane touched down, pulling her bag from the overhead with a loud grunt and brushing against Zoraya, as if she weren't there. No apology, no glance. Not when the final drink service had passed her without pause. Not when the woman beside her had deliberately coughed into the open air, then muttered a feigned apology just loud enough to draw sideward glances. Not even when the young attendant returned to offer moist towelettes to everyone in the row and extended her arm over Zoraya's face to hand one to the other passenger while skipping her completely. The air around Zoraya was heavy with something unspoken, like static before storm. The attendants had moved on from her entirely, no longer even pretending to mask their avoidance with professionalism. The other passengers had followed their lead, some watching with smirks, others averting their eyes, all complicit in silence. Zoraya had become furniture in their luxury world, a fixture to be ignored or maneuvered around, not a person with agency or presence. And yet, despite the degradation she endured, she sat with a strange stillness, a strange calm that was neither defeat nor compliance. It was calculation. The aircraft pulled into the gate and the familiar chime sounded, the one that always marked the end of a journey and the beginning of polite chaos as people unbuckled, reached overhead, and shoved toward the front. This time, there was no urgency from Zoraya. The woman in 2B stood immediately, grabbing her expensive purse and adjusting her coat with the air of someone finally freed from an unpleasant inconvenience. She stepped into the aisle and joined the shuffle forward. One by one, passengers collected their things, chatting casually with the crew, offering compliments and thanks. Blythe stood near the exit, her smile back in place, thanking passengers for flying with them, her tone cheerful and professional, as if nothing had transpired over the last 7 hours. Zoraya remained seated, her seatbelt still fastened, her hands still resting gently in her lap. She made no move to leave. The last of the passengers exited. The woman from 2B was long gone. The cabin crew began their routine checks, but Blythe noticed Zoraya had not moved. She hesitated, walked halfway down the aisle, and finally spoke. "Ma'am, we've landed. You may exit now." Her tone was measured, but already tinged with impatience. Zoraya looked up slowly, her gaze steady, her voice quiet. "I'll wait." Blythe blinked. "Excuse me." Zoraya repeated, "I'll wait." Her tone was unflinching, not aggressive, but unshakably calm. Blythe narrowed her eyes, stepping closer. "Ma'am, we need to prepare for the next leg. If there's a concern, I can call airport services to assist." "You should," Zoraya interrupted. "You should absolutely do that." The words were cool, almost clinical. Blythe faltered slightly, then turned and radioed the gate agent. Zoraya sat still, her posture relaxed, but her presence now undeniable. 5 minutes passed, then 10. A gate agent appeared, clipboard in hand, followed by an assistant manager in a navy blazer with a plastic ID badge clipped near his collar. He entered the cabin with cautious curiosity, taking in the empty seats, the clean floor, and then finally stopping at Zoraya, who remained unmoved. "Good morning," he said, his voice overly pleasant. "I understand there may have been an issue on your flight." Zoraya looked up at him fully now, her expression unreadable. "No issue," she said, "but I would like to speak with someone from the executive team." The man hesitated. "Executive team?" Zoraya nodded slowly. "Yes. Please inform your operations director that Zoraya Ellison is requesting a meeting before deplaning." The man's polite smile faltered. "I'm sorry, did you say Ellison?" She offered a small nod. "Yes, Zoraya Ellison. I believe your internal systems will confirm that name is associated with Equity Holdings. Please check." The gate agent stepped back, pulled a tablet from his bag, and began tapping. The assistant manager didn't move. Zoraya's voice remained even. "You can also verify it through the shareholder ledger or through the board liaison office. I'll wait." Her tone wasn't angry. It wasn't loud, but it was final. Blythe, who had been watching from the galley, stepped forward, trying to maintain control. "Ma'am, we really need to clear the cabin." There are protocols. You followed protocol very carefully this flight, Zoraya interrupted without looking at her. Continue to do so now. The tablet beeped. The gate agent froze. He glanced up with wide eyes and immediately stepped aside to whisper something to the assistant manager, who went pale. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. I wasn't aware that you weren't supposed to be, Zoraya said, finally rising from her seat with slow, deliberate grace. That's the point. You weren't supposed to know who I was, but you did know what I looked like, and that was enough for every decision that followed. The tablet in the gate agent's hand had been passed to another staffer from corporate arrivals. The name Zoraya Ellison wasn't just a passenger manifest anomaly anymore. It was a potential crisis. Within minutes, internal alerts pinged across senior management servers. A Level 2 incident flag had been raised from onboard. Not for violence, not for safety, but for potential discrimination involving a Class A shareholder, one whose name had been buried quietly in the equity reports and seldom discussed outside board-level meetings. Zoraya didn't wait for anyone. She moved through the terminal with a grace shaped by years of boardrooms and headlines. But today she walked not as a symbol or a figure. She walked as a woman who had been humiliated in silence and had chosen not to stay quiet. Her phone buzzed in her purse, unread. She didn't check it. The moment she had revealed her name, everything had changed, not because her identity made her any more human, but because her name carried weight in places where her skin had not. That truth settled in her bones heavier than the fatigue of the flight. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply walked forward, certain now of what had to follow. Back at the aircraft, the crew stood frozen in the galley. The senior flight attendant, Blythe, no longer carried the confident air of a professional in control. Her clipboard trembled slightly in her hand as she attempted to finish the post-flight checklist. The junior attendants whispered near the exit, their earlier smirks now erased, replaced with tight lips and darting eyes. "Did you see the email?" one of them asked quietly. The other nodded, glancing toward the front of the plane. "VP of Operations wants a full incident report. ASAP." Blythe said nothing. Her mind replayed every decision she'd made, every skip towel, every tray withheld, every time she'd looked directly at Zoraya and chosen to see nothing. In the moment, she'd felt justified. Now, those choices sat on her shoulders like bricks. In the airport's administrative office, a different scene unfolded. A small conference room had been quickly converted into a containment space. Screens displayed flight manifests, passenger interactions, and crew logs. The operations director, a man named Carson Wells, paced behind the head of the table, his brow furrowed. He hadn't been told Zoraya Ellison was on that flight. She wasn't the kind of shareholder who made demands or requested special treatment. She didn't wear her power like a badge. She wore it like a watch. Always present, always ticking, always precise. And now, every second that passed without a formal response risked escalation. "Get me the footage," Carson ordered. "Every second from gate to landing. And pull the passenger service records. I want timestamps, refusals, tray service logs. Everything." A young analyst nodded and started tapping frantically at the keyboard. The room buzzed with the quiet intensity of people who knew they were one misstep away from a scandal. Meanwhile, Zoraya entered the executive lounge. No one stopped her. The desk agent glanced at her name, blinked twice, then stood straighter and called someone from the back without a word. A private suite was opened within seconds. She stepped inside, closed the door, and sat. Only then did she breathe fully for the first time since takeoff. She removed her blazer and stared at her reflection in the dark glass wall. The woman who looked back at her was the same woman who had boarded that plane, elegant, poised, ready to rest. But something had shifted in her eyes. Not rage, not victory, just clarity. They had seen her as nothing. She had reminded them she was not only someone, but someone they had already quietly depended on. Her assistant finally called. She answered on speaker, voice low. "It's done," she said simply. "They know." "How bad is it?" he asked. "Bad enough they'll panic. Not loud enough to go public." "Not yet. You want me to call Julian?" Zoraya didn't respond for a moment. Julian, her husband, was currently in Geneva attending a shareholders' roundtable with European investors. He held 12% of the airline's total equity, the second largest private stake next to the founders. He wouldn't be happy, but he didn't need to be angry yet. Not until she said so. "No," she replied. "Let's see how they respond." That response came swiftly. Less than 20 minutes later, a senior liaison entered the lounge suite. She was tall, mid-40s, impeccably dressed, and visibly nervous despite her composed face. "Ms. Ellison," she began, extending a hand. "My name is Tamara Rhodes. I'm the liaison for Executive Guest Affairs. I'd like to personally apologize." "Don't," Zoraya said, still seated. "Don't apologize until you've read the report." Tamara blinked. "We're reviewing it now, I assure you. I've been asked to speak with you directly." "Not good enough," Zoraya interrupted. "Not until your team acknowledges what happened on that flight. In full. Not just to me, but what they revealed about your culture." Tamara took a breath, nodded slowly. "We understand. May I sit?" Zoraya nodded once. Tamara eased into the chair across from her. The silence that followed was long, measured. "You don't need to fear me," Zoraya finally said. "But you do need to fear what I represent. If someone like me is treated this way, what do you think happens to the passengers who don't own a percentage of your company? Who don't have the ability to call your board members by name?" Carson Wells, the operations director, had been pulled from his office, where he'd been reviewing unrelated reports, and ushered into an emergency video conference with the airline's executive leadership. His jaw was tight, eyes sharp as he absorbed the details delivered by his team. The systematic mistreatment of a key shareholder during a transatlantic flight, documented thoroughly by passenger reports, crew logs, and surveillance footage that had been rapidly downloaded and reviewed. The board was furious, and the optics were worse. A shareholder holding more than 12% of the company had been publicly humiliated by the very staff entrusted with their safety and comfort. This was not a scandal to be buried. It was a crisis demanding immediate, decisive action. Meanwhile, back at the airport terminal, Zoraya moved with quiet purpose through the corridors, fully aware that the wheels of corporate power were turning fast behind her. Her phone finally buzzed with a message from Julian, her husband and fellow major shareholder, a terse text urging her to stay calm and let the company handle the fallout. Advice she knew was well-intentioned, but also unrealistic. She did not reply. She had spent too many years navigating power dynamics that favored silence and compromise to accept that now. This time, her voice would be heard, and the consequences would be real. She arrived at a private meeting room reserved for VIPs and executives. The sterile walls and muted lighting a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. The door opened, and Tamara Rhodes entered, followed closely by Carson Wells and another senior executive, a woman named Eleanor Grant, who oversaw human resources and corporate culture initiatives. Their expressions were a mix of apprehension and determination. Zoraya gestured for them to sit, settling herself with a calm that masked the exhaustion beneath. Without preamble, she outlined the events of the flight, detailing not just the overt neglect, but the systemic culture of exclusion that had allowed it to happen. Her voice was steady, every word deliberate. The executives listened intently, some nodding, others taking notes. There was no defensiveness, only the stark reality of accountability. Outside the meeting room, word spread quickly among the staff. The flight crew from the ill-fated Flight 346 were quietly pulled aside and told to await a separate briefing. Rumors flew through the ranks, a mix of fear and resentment, whispers of suspensions and investigations. Blythe Cormack sat in the crew lounge, staring blankly at her reflection in the darkened window. The confident professionalism she'd worn like armor was cracked, and she could feel the weight of her choices pressing down. Her phone rang repeatedly, but she ignored it, unwilling to face the inevitable calls from HR or legal. The junior attendants, who had once exchanged secretive smiles at Zoraya's expense, now avoided each other's eyes. The camaraderie born of shared exclusion was replaced by uncertainty and dread. Meanwhile, airline security was tasked with reviewing footage from a flight, combing through interactions frame by frame for evidence of misconduct. Every ignored request, every skipped service, every cold glance was cataloged. The day progressed with an air of tense urgency. Press releases were drafted behind closed doors. Legal counsel prepared contingency statements, and the corporate communications team planned a message to stakeholders. The airline's board held an emergency session, convening via video link from around the globe. Julian Carter joined from Geneva, his presence both reassuring and commanding. The mood was somber. They all understood the stakes. This incident could not be swept under the rug. It was a reckoning, not only for the airline's treatment of one woman, but for its public image and commitment to diversity and inclusion. Every executive spoke of damage control and the need for systemic change. Late afternoon, Zoraya was escorted from the private meeting to a press conference room set up discreetly at the airport. Cameras and microphones were poised, waiting for statements to be made and narratives to be controlled. She faced the assembled journalists with a composed demeanor, the weight of the previous hours etched lightly around her eyes, but her voice unwavering as she addressed the incident. She spoke not only of her own experience, but of the broader issues of discrimination and accountability within corporate structures. Her words were measured, powerful, and poised to resonate far beyond the airline industry. Behind the scenes, her legal team reviewed every sentence, prepared for the inevitable fallout, but also for the opportunity to set a new standard. The airline's official statement was released hours later, acknowledging the incident and promising a thorough investigation. It expressed regret and reaffirmed a commitment to a culture of respect and inclusion. But more importantly, it announced immediate disciplinary actions: the suspension of the entire flight crew involved, pending investigation, and the formation of an independent review board to assess company-wide policies and training programs. The corporate message was clear: discrimination would not be tolerated. Whether this translated into meaningful change remained to be seen, but the first step had been taken. The aftermath of the incident rippled through Skylux Airlines like an unexpected storm, unsettling long-standing structures of complacency and silence. The airline's boardroom, usually a place of polished confidence and quiet transactions, became the epicenter of urgent strategy sessions, heated debates, and stark realizations. Zoraya Ellison, once a silent passenger enduring indignities in the sky, had emerged as an unyielding force demanding change not only for herself, but for every passenger and employee who had suffered under the veil of polite neglect and covert discrimination. The very walls that had once shielded behaviors unspoken were now lined with reports, videos, and testimonies that left little room for denial. Board members who had once turned a blind eye found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths. The company's public image was fragile, its reputation tarnished by a scandal that underscored systemic failures far deeper than a single flight crew's misconduct. Zoraya, in the weeks following her flight, remained both resolute and remarkably composed. She chose to wield her influence with a quiet authority rather than ostentatious displays. Her presence at the company's headquarters shifted the dynamics immediately. Meeting rooms filled with executives, HR personnel, and diversity consultants became arenas where old policies were dissected and new ones forged. Zoraya's insistence was clear: real change required more than apologies. It demanded accountability, transparency, and an unwavering commitment to equity. She spearheaded initiatives that established independent oversight committees, anonymous reporting channels for discrimination, and mandatory, ongoing training programs designed to uproot implicit biases. No corner of the company was exempt. From hiring practices to in-flight protocols, from customer service scripts to leadership hiring, every process was scrutinized. Her vision extended beyond Skylux's cabins to set a new industry standard, one where inclusion was embedded in the fabric of airline culture, not just a marketing slogan. At the heart of these transformations was a subtle but profound shift in power. The flight attendants and managers who had once treated Zoraya with disdain found themselves removed from their positions or reassigned to roles with diminished authority. Blythe Cormack, whose actions had symbolized a systemic failure, was among those who faced suspension and mandatory sensitivity retraining. Her name quietly but permanently removed from flight rosters. The airline's leadership publicly affirmed their stance, issuing a statement promising zero tolerance for discrimination and acknowledging the courage of Ms. Ellison in bringing this to light. The statement was accompanied by a pledge to support victims and foster a safe, respectful environment for all passengers and employees. Media outlets seized on the story, framing it not as a one-off scandal, but as a watershed moment in corporate responsibility and racial justice. Zoraya's experience sparked broader conversations, inspiring other industries to examine their own cultures and practices through a renewed lens of equity. Despite the intense public scrutiny and the weight of her role, Zoraya remained focused on the bigger picture. She understood that while her own ordeal had been the catalyst, the fight for justice was far from over. She used her platform to mentor young professionals of color, to fund scholarships for underrepresented communities aspiring to careers in aviation, and to collaborate with advocacy groups pushing for systemic reforms. Her story was shared widely, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a blueprint for resilience and transformative leadership. In interviews and keynote speeches, she spoke eloquently about the necessity of confronting uncomfortable truths and the power of persistent courage. She highlighted that true justice transcends punishment. It requires rebuilding systems so that such indignities never occur again. Her message resonated deeply in an era hungry for change but wary of performative gestures. Zoraya's relationship with her husband Julian also took on new dimensions. Together, they navigated the challenges of leveraging their combined influence to foster meaningful progress within Skylux and beyond. Julian, whose stake in the airline was significant, used his own networks to advocate for policy reforms, ensuring that the momentum Zoraya generated did not dissipate amid corporate inertia. Their partnership became emblematic of committed allyship and the collaborative effort needed to dismantle entrenched inequities. While the incident could have been a source of division or retreat, it instead strengthened their resolve and deepened their shared purpose. Months after the flight, Skylux Airlines unveiled a new corporate initiative named the Ellison Equity Program, a comprehensive strategy to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion across all levels. The program incorporated employee resource groups, enhanced bias reporting systems, and partnerships with organizations dedicated to social justice. The airline hosted its first-ever Diversity and Inclusion Summit, inviting leaders from across industries to participate in conversations aimed at dismantling systemic barriers. Zoraya was the keynote speaker, standing before a packed auditorium, her voice steady and compelling. She spoke not just of her personal journey, but of the collective responsibility to foster environments where every individual is valued and respected. The audience responded with standing ovations and heartfelt engagement, signaling a shift in corporate culture that went beyond rhetoric. The cabin where Zoraya had once been isolated saw tangible changes. Flight crews underwent rigorous new training designed to identify and counteract implicit bias. Passenger feedback mechanisms were revamped to ensure that complaints of discrimination were addressed swiftly and transparently. Zoraya herself occasionally flew Skylux, not as a silent passenger, but as a guardian of the company's values, observing and occasionally engaging with crew and passengers alike. Her presence was a reminder that equity was not optional but foundational. The final meaning of this journey was clear. Justice was not a moment, but a movement. The silent endurance Zoraya had embodied on that flight had sparked a transformation that reverberated throughout the airline and the industry at large. It demonstrated that confronting injustice requires more than calling out individual acts. It demands persistent action to change the structures that allow those acts to persist. Her story ended not in bitterness or retreat, but in the forging of a legacy, one where silence gave way to voice, exclusion to inclusion, and pain to progress. In this, Zoraya Ellison's journey became a beacon for all who strive for dignity and fairness, proving that even the quietest voices can create the loudest echoes of change. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the plot? Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and join the conversation.